It's a pleasure. There it is. It's a pleasure to formally introduce myself. My name is Taylor Swanson. I'm an Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake Outreach Coordinator, and I help run our communications. Please, since this is such a big event, we have so many friends and faces here from across the watershed, please put your name in the chat. You could also include where you're from or what congregation you're a part of. We really want to get to meet you, and we want you to get to meet everyone else who's a part of our event tonight. We have a really packed show, so I don't want to hold up too much time. In a moment, I'm going to introduce a friend, a colleague, partial mentor, Ruth Ann Purchase, who's going to be delivering a water acknowledgement with an Indigenous focus. I'm also then going to introduce who Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake is, what our One Water Partnership program is, how you can get involved, and how it pertains to helping the Chesapeake Bay and water quality here in our region. And finally, I'm going to introduce you to our three amazing panelists, Betsy Nicholas, Ann Swanson, and Caitlin Schmidt, who are going to help us break apart what the Clean Water Act is and why it's so important for our region. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Ruth Ann Purchase. She's a linguist turned sociologist of Lenape Welsh descent, whose studies have taken her across the globe. She's also the founder of the Lipsick River Watershed Association, the Greenbridge Community Development Corporation, and Friends of Lenape Everywhere. Ruth Ann lives and works in the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware Federal Census District as a cultural mapping project manager and with the American House Alliance in Philadelphia as an outreach coordinator. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Ruth Ann Purchase.
Wanishiwemi, thank you much, Taylor. Today we wish to hold space for a silent reflection and gratitude toward the land upon which we live and the local waters that support and nourish us all. We recognize that this land and these waters were stewarded by many, many who came before us. Tens of thousands of years, Algonquian-speaking cousins called the shores of the Chesapeake Bay home. Although we've lost many names, we ask you to say their names aloud and learn to honor, restoring honor for their stewardship of these ancient lands and waters. So I'm going to say the names of those tribes who have lived for centuries in the Chesapeake watershed. Lenape, Nanticoke, Kusarawak, Piscataway, Choptank, Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nasemond, Pamunkey, Rappahannock, Cheroinkakan, Nottoway, Patamoic, Anahonac, Nausewawash, the Assateague, the Pocomoke, and the Weekomies. The original people believed that they belonged to these lands and waters, not the other way around. And their spirituality and their personal identity and community identity were all based in their place, their spiritual identity, place-based. It was displaced by European settlers who scarred the land with brutal institution of forced slavery and extermination, a legacy of which we are all still working to overcome. And the waters of the Chesapeake have witnessed and borne ill treatment themselves as the forests are removed, as the lands are poisoned, paved over, and populations of other species are decimated by the loss of habitat and overconsumption. But we reflect together as people of faith, people of hope, and people of love for the water in response to the calling of our hearts and the calling of the water, for she truly calls to us to come alongside the ancient stewards of these waters that sustain us all. We seek to change the narrative of our story toward one of harmony with the gifts of creation and of all living things. May we act upon this calling in a way that helps us not only to heal the wounds of the natural world, but our own wounds of our common story as we come together with honor and life. So I'd like to introduce you to one of the grandmothers that I honor very much. She's an Ojibwe speaker and an Anishinaabe clan mother. And she has been very influential in facilitating the walks, the water walkers who walked all the way around the Great Lakes and set such a beautiful example of singing blessings over the water. And if we have time at the end of our gathering, I'll sing a water blessing for you that this particular grandmother sang in Ojibwe, and I translated it into the Lenape, which is the local language, the closest language that I have learned to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So hear from an elder.
In general, and especially the water walkers who have walked with me. There have been a lot of supporters who all over Turtle Island. I guess that everybody seems to be a water walker now because they've either participated somehow in water walk. And so when I say we, I think about them. And our First Nations are the Ojibways, the Odawas, and the Potawatomis, are Three Fires Society that I belong to. My Indian name is Bidasage, which means one who comes with the light. And my clan is the fish clan. Watsisi is the name of the fish that that are my clans. So when I talk about how we as Anishinaabe people, we have to carry our sovereignty, our work as we have been governed by the Creator, because we are when we're brought down by the spirit world down to the physical world. We're given responsibilities, roles that we have to do. We have to take care of our mother the earth, and that's what we're doing now, is taking care of our mother the earth. We have to, especially now in this day and age where she is really suffering. She's being polluted, she's being prostituted, she's being sold, she's all these things that are happening to her is happening to us women now. And so when I think about how we as women have to start picking up our bundles, we have to really think about how important it is that we have to really know who we are as women, that we're very powerful women. We can be very, very instrumental in how things are changing.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I hope this inspires you to realize that water walkers all across Turtle Island consider us part of their work. We, she said we, and she honored the power of women. And tonight we have so many beautiful women here to share their water advocacy with us. And it is an honor for me to be here with you and share this talking stick tonight. Wanishi Wemi Mbi Etachole. Thank you very much. And thank you to the waters.
Thank you so much, Ruth Ann. It was a beautiful start to our program. And before I introduce three amazing women, I want to share very briefly a little bit about Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, especially for those who are new to our programming and new to us. We want to let you know how to get involved in what we're doing. The Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake is truly in the business of starting a movement of faithful stewards, caring for the waters and the lands of the Chesapeake Bay, looking for people who want to care for their nook and corner of the Chesapeake watershed. I think no one has said it better than a friend and colleague of mine, a pastor at one of our congregations in Baltimore, Pastor Michael Martin, who said, "I don't know how to change the world, and I don't know how to change the country, and I don't know how to change the world, but I do know how to have an impact in my neighborhood where my parish is. I think this is a really profound statement. I think it's very on theme for tonight, you'll find, because we're surrounded in a world of these daunting environmental problems. Climate change, rainforest destruction, overconsumption, deforestation. These are all problems that the average person cannot fathom how to overcome. And the truth is that we got into this problem, we got into this mess because of a million bad decisions. And we can only get out of this mess by making a million good decisions, and with each of us caring for our little corner of the world. So what is our Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake? Well, besides having a variety of our own programs to help strengthen your own internal ability within your congregation to take on environmental challenges, we like to help connect people to people and organizations to organizations to help foster change, eliminate red tape where we can, and promote stewardship. We're doing this all across the watershed, and in fact, everywhere that we are finding major support, we form one water partnership hubs. You can see on this map over 100 congregations that have now signed the Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake Partner Congregation Pledge, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. And all of these are areas in which we have regional coordinators who can help you foster stewardship at your own congregation. Don't worry, if you're not part of one of these counties where we have a one water partnership hub, we still have outreach coordinators and staff all over the watershed. I'm really eager to meet you and learn how we can help. It's a pleasure to also thank all of our event sponsors and partners for tonight. I want to give special thanks to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Chesapeake Bay Trust for being the major funders for tonight. And I want to thank each and every one of my speakers and presenters and panelists for joining us. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our three speakers for the evening. Joining us first and speaking will be Betsy Nicholas, the Executive Director of Waterkeepers Chesapeake. Betsy Nicholas has been the Executive Director of Waterkeepers Chesapeake, which is the regional coalition of 17 waterkeepers protecting the rivers and streams of the Chesapeake and Coastal Bay watersheds. Since joining in 2012, Ms. Nicholas has been a steadfast advocate for clean water and a healthy environment by supporting waterkeeper organizations throughout the Chesapeake and coastal regions as they protect their communities, rivers, and streams from pollution. Up next is Ms. Ann Swanson, the Executive Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Ms. Swanson has served as a leader in the Bay restoration for 39 years. The last 34 as the Executive Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, which is a tri-state legislative authority serving the states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. She's also my mother. Finally speaking is Ms. Caitlin Schmidt, a senior policy analyst from the Center for Progressive Reform. Ms. Schmidt joined the Center for Progressive Reform in 2020 to work on environmental policy, enforcement, and advocacy. Before joining, Ms. Schmidt spent 4 years working as the legal and policy director for Waterkeepers Chesapeake, where she provided legal assistance to the waterkeepers and advocated for legislative and regulatory priorities. It's now my pleasure to welcome our first speaker to talk about the Clean Water Act and its legacy of impact, Betsy Nicholas.
Thank you, Taylor. And it really is a pretty amazing group of people that we have speaking tonight. All of our work is very intertwined, as you will see as we go throughout this presentation. One thing I want to flag from the very beginning, you might hear it more than once from me. It's a pretty important anniversary this year. I turned 50. No, I did actually. But the Clean Water Act also is turning 50. And so it's really a huge opportunity for us to think about what this law has done for us at the federal, the regional, the state, and the local level. And we're going to be talking about all of that some this evening. Next. So I want to start with why. Why do we have this law? Why does the Clean Water Act exist? And we need it. We had really kind of unfettered dumping. We had our rivers and streams, particularly those going through our cities, just used as where you dispose of things. That these environmental disasters were mounting as populations grew, as city centers became larger. The amount of pollution, from industrial facilities, from development, from all kinds of things became so bad that we had rivers catching on fire. This is the Cuyahoga in Cleveland. I was actually there a few years ago for a conference and saw the changes on this river. But this was not the only fire. You know, it's something that people hear about a lot, that, oh, the Cuyahoga caught on fire. In this time period, it caught on fire several times, and it was not the only one. Next. There were water bodies all over. This is again in the general Cleveland area. This is why we had our rivers catching on fire. Think of all of these cars, all the pollution coming out of them, the gasoline leaking into the water, the motor oil, the mercury, all of these different things, because we weren't respecting these water bodies and their uses for us. Next. This is California. This is a more recent one because it was a better picture. But again, this was happening in that time period of the late 60s and 70s, and the entire coastline was covered with a gigantic oil slick, resulting in thousands and thousands of fish, birds, marine mammals that were killed and were floating up on shore, and people realized how bad this was. Next. So more locally, we have, and again, these are slightly more recent pictures too, which tells you we've got a long way to go. But one of the things you may not know about the dirty history of Congress and the Anacostia River is for decades and decades, actually probably hundreds of years, flush a toilet in the Capitol, it goes straight into the Anacostia River, which is a tributary to the Potomac, right in the middle of DC. And this kind of pollution, trash, filth, untreated waste was just building up in all of the cities across this country. Next. And so that's really what led to the passage in 1972 of the Federal Clean Water Act. When you have all of that kind of pollution, this is an algae bloom. When you have this kind of an algae bloom, nothing can live. It sucks all of the oxygen out of the water and you end up with massive fish kills. So there was a resounding voice coming from communities. This wasn't, I mean, not that I'm not going to say there isn't any credit to the federal leaders on this, but it was communities, people like everyone who's on this webinar this evening, standing up and saying, these are our resources, and thus the passage of the Clean Water Act, with the objective of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Next. And this was the first real ability to recognize that water is all of ours. It doesn't belong to just those who are polluting. It is something that all of us have a right to clean water. So the Clean Water Act set out a couple of important goals. One of them was ensuring, and hoping to do it by 1983, we still got some work to do, fishable and swimmable waters. These are the base needs of our waterways. And then adding in later drinkable. That's regulated primarily under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it is an important part of this. And then eliminating, this is, utopia to think about this, but eliminating all discharges of pollutants into navigable waters. And we can talk a little bit about that, but anytime you see a water body where you can get any kind of craft down it, boats, etc., you're probably dealing with what is considered to be a navigable waterway. So we have a little ways to go. Next. The right to clean water is not an exclusive right. And that is not what, unfortunately, what the system set up. What they set up in the Clean Water Act was that you can allow some pollution into waterways. And so they set up a permitting system. The name is probably less relevant to you than boring lawyers like me, but National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, people call them NPDES, permits, but generally you think of these in terms of what we call a point source. And that pipe, that's your point. So if you ever hear people talk about a point source, that means that you can identify exactly where that pollution source is coming from, as opposed to what we call non-point source pollution, which is just all of that other stuff. So that's the pollution on the land that gets washed into our waterways when it rains. And the permitting system is based on how much of a pollutant can you put into the waterway and still maintain those uses. How much can you put in before you're hurting the use for fishing, swimming, etc. And so that's the system we have built up. It is not perfect. It has some problems, but it's a whole lot better than no regulation of pollution whatsoever. Next. So the most important part of how the Clean Water Act works was it recognized at the get-go that government might not always do its job, whether it's they don't have the resources, the time, or the will to do it. What the Clean Water Act did is create what they call the citizen suit provision. And that means that every person, all of you, have the ability to enforce the law when government has failed to do so. And when you are harmed by pollution, you can take action. That's a lot of the reason that groups like mine and all the water keepers exist, is because we can represent all of you when you're harmed and take action. We don't get money for that. You only can enforce the law as if you're stepping into the shoes of that government agency. And this has been so effective at filling in these holes when government doesn't do it, that we have 25% of all enforcement actions over the last decade were brought by waterkeeper organizations across the country. So we've been busy. Next. And I just wanted to kind of walk through a little bit of an example of the types of actions that we take with a slaughterhouse. There are a lot of regulated facilities, meaning that they have to get a permit, one of these NPDES permits. And there's also a lot of standards that are set as to what is that safety limit. What's that if you put more pollution than this in there, that it's going to make it so you can no longer fish or swim in that waterway, or it might cause harm to human health. Slaughterhouses are an industry that EPA was supposed to update that safety limit, and they didn't. And we have a lot of them, billions of chickens, hundreds of millions of pigs, cattle, etc. There's a lot of waste that comes from them. Our standards are usually set by something that's called the best available technology. And that basically means that the limit, that health limit, is set by, well, how much pollution can you get out? What's the technology that exists that we can use here? And that's not what was being used. Next. So Waterkeepers Chesapeake, along with Waterkeeper Alliance and many other groups, stepped forward and said that EPA has to update these limits, that they date back to 1974 and 1975. That is not okay. So in 2019, they said that they would not be revising them, and then also identified that these were the largest industrial source of nitrogen and nitrogen water pollution. As many of you know, and as Anne will be talking about, nitrogen's kind of a big deal in our region and in water quality. Next. So this is a partial victory at this point, but count our victories where we have them, right? Based on our lawsuit, EPA announced that they were going to be updating these limits. We feel that there's more that needs to be done. And so we're continuing a piece of it to make sure that that goes all the way through and that that update actually occurs so that we have safer standards set for our waterways and for this industry. A little bit before that, a couple of years before that, we had also done a similar suit requiring EPA to update drinking water standards, but it's the same sort of thing. When the agencies get behind on this, we need to give them a little push, and we get the right to because of the citizen suit provision. Next. So hopefully I didn't depress you too much with some of these pollution problems, because despite the frustration sometimes that we have with pollution in our waterways, they are so much better. We also have just tremendous success stories about much cleaner water than it used to be, particularly in light of the population growth. So this year in the 50th anniversary, that's part of what we want to do. We want to celebrate that success, that so many of our waterways are cleaner, that places that you used to walk away from even seeing because they smelled so bad, looked so bad, were on fire. Now you can go swimming, you can go kayaking, you can enjoy that waterway. So for this campaign, that's a lot of what we want to do. We want to connect our communities with their local waterways. They can get on them directly, canoeing, kayaking, all that sort of thing. They can do walks along the water. They can just remember it. We have a sacred waters ceremony later, very much along the lines of what Ruth Ann was talking about later this summer. And we would like to invite you to be part of this celebration. And it's not all just fun. We're also going to be thinking about how we can work together as communities to address those lingering challenges as well as those that have grown. Environmental justice is something that just still has not been properly dealt with through this law, and ensuring equity in funding and pollution cleanups. And we also have that lingering little threat out there of climate change that's changing everything we do. So we want to be proactive and getting people involved in building that agenda for the next 50 years. But let's have a little fun while we're doing it too on the water. And so now I'm going to hand it over to an absolutely brilliant colleague who I rely on for information all the time, Ann Swanson of the Chesapeake Bay Commission.
Well, hi, thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be here with not only my esteemed colleagues who are fellow speakers, but also everybody on the line. Let me say that I often, and I'm getting a thing that says unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great, Ann.
Okay, good, thank you. So I often take my titling and agendas quite seriously as I consider how to proceed. And I want to particularly call your attention to the subtext of this title, because I've never done this talk before. I really had to think about it. And I want to thank the Interfaith Partnership for pushing me to do this presentation, because I had to really think, what is the relationship between the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, now well over 40 years old, really pushing on 50 years old in concerted effort. And I realized that this single law has influenced, probably more than any other law, America's most comprehensive restoration campaign. And when you think about it, that means it's had profound influence on one of the world's most comprehensive restoration campaigns, because that is the stature at a global level of the Chesapeake restoration effort. Now, let me pause right there and say many of you might say, yeah, but it's still dirty. But in truth, the Chesapeake restoration effort is further along than almost any other restoration campaign across the globe. And so while our glass might be half empty, it is the Clean Water Act that has made it half full as well. So with that, let me just say that I'm very happy that you have joined us. Thank you one and all. And also particularly thank you to Taylor, who has organized this event. So next. Let me start. I'm going to start you with a little bit of history. That seems to be the place where we should begin. And really, just similar to the slides that Betsy showed you, the 1960s and the 1970s saw a very visible decline in Chesapeake Bay. At the same time, another thing was happening, and that was in Baltimore around 1964. A group of Baltimore businessmen that were really sailors and waterfowl hunters and fishermen, they began having lunch together to discuss common problems they saw and sort of what was happening on a national scale. And of course, things were happening. Environmental concern was growing. The Congress was having hearings. And ultimately, what they realized was we have poor water quality, we have poor sewage treatment, we have dirty industrial discharges, our boats are showing scum on the sides. We really had more people, more houses, more development, but with it, more fish kills, things like that. And so ultimately, they contacted Governor Tawes and said, what is the government going to do about this? And Governor Tawes very notably said, you know what? The government, you can't expect government to fix all the bay's problems. So that really explains a piece of the origin of the Bay Foundation. So at the same time you had visible declines, you had the growing of an interjurisdictional organization to shepherd things. Next. So what were they seeing? You saw the algal blooms in Betsy's presentation. Take a look at them here. This is the Chesapeake Bay region, but what they were seeing was algal blooms are not unique to any one place. They are different in different places and they have different impacts. In one area, it might be affecting drinking water. In another area, it might be affecting fish. In another area, it may be clouding the water so that the seagrasses can't photosynthesize and therefore are dying. In some areas, they're toxic, where if people go swimming, they actually develop rashes. And so what they saw was this was an interjurisdictional problem requiring local solutions, different solutions in different parts of the watershed. The other important thing to note here is that when algae grows, it's a small plant, so it photosynthesizes, which means it makes oxygen. However, when they die, they actually consume more oxygen when they're decaying than they actually made, which means you end up with a dissolved oxygen deficit. And the result is you end up, next, Taylor, with fish kills. And so there were a lot of fish kills. And not only were there fish kills in the Chesapeake Bay, but the other thing was happening was they were having this crazy thing called a crab jubilee. It is the most ridiculous use of it, the English language, because what a jubilee is when the crabs are so lacking in oxygen in the water to breathe that they actually run out of the water and onto the land in order to get a slug of oxygen back into their systems. So that caused incredible concern in the region. Next. And so the third thing that they were seeing was they were seeing amazing sedimentation. The sedimentation was clouding the water. Again, that was a problem for the seagrasses, a problem for the oysters and the crabs and the different organisms that rely on clean water. But the other thing they were seeing when it came to sediment, and what you're seeing here is you are seeing the very northern tip of the bay. You can see the Susquehanna feeding into the northern part of the bay. This is 1972. So think about right when the Clean Water Act was being established. This is Hurricane Agnes delivering such a tonnage of sediment that some say the bay is still recovering from that single episode. And so what they saw again was that there were enormous impacts that were not local. These were interstate. So in some situations, you saw very local needs for a response. In others, you saw interstate needs. But at the end, it was all happening locally, contributing to that interstate problem. Next. So now let's dial forward. So what then happens next? Well, first of all, in the Clean Water Act, of course, is now passing in the Congress, 1972. Let me pause there and say something, that for the Clean Water Act, Betsy focused on citizenry. Right at the very origin of the Clean Water Act, there ended up being this dance between essentially the government, the president, and of course his administration, the Congress, okay, and also the people. Because ultimately what happened was the Congress passed the Clean Water Act. The president then vetoed the Clean Water Act, that was Nixon, and then the Congress overrode it. So then the president actually took the money that was supposed to be billions, I think it was $24 billion, was supposed to then fund the Clean Water Act at that point, and he cordoned it off. He cordoned it off in a separate act that said you can't spend it. And ultimately then it was the citizenry, and I think it was the state of Connecticut that took them to court and said, no, you cannot cordon off the funding that is meant for the people and the people's water. So right from the get-go, there's always been this dance between the implementation of the Clean Water Act and of course, questioning the full breadth and authority of that act. So next, Taylor. In 1976, what happened next was that as part of the Clean Water Act and as a part of this newly established Environmental Protection Agency, the Congress, with Mac Mathias in the lead, he was the senator from Maryland, they triggered a very comprehensive study of Chesapeake because he was seeing the crab jubilees and the watermen were calling it dirty water. They were saying we have bad water, which meant the water wasn't sufficient to support the animals. And ultimately, that's the passion in Chesapeake Bay. It's not really the water so much because you can float on the water or even swim in relatively dirty water, but it's really the fisheries, the bounty of organisms that come with the Chesapeake and its productivity that made people just want cleaner water. And so I should also pause here and say about half the population in the Chesapeake get their water from surface water. And so that also is a major concern in terms of clean water. So this study took a look at the Chesapeake. It was a 7-year, $27 million study, one of the most comprehensive of its kind. And in the end, it not only documented the problems like Betsy suggested with nitrogen, but it also demanded solutions. Next. The other thing that happened in that time frame is there was this study coming out with no interstate authority to respond to it. Who would respond at an interstate level? We had states, we had local governments, but we had no regional authority yet. We did not even have the Chesapeake Bay program. So what happened was the states got together and each passed independent laws that created this TriState Legislative Commission. That's who I work for. And it's made up of House and Senate members and the governors of each jurisdiction, and it's Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And basically what it was is a way to coordinate policy across state lines, not necessarily expecting sameness, but coordinated so that ultimately you get to the same goal while respecting the cultures and the individual differences of the jurisdictions. Next. Okay, so all that's happening. So now you've got the Clean Water Act, you've got the Bay Commission, you've got the Bay Foundation, you have it all happening. And we've got science as our base. The science is essentially the Clean Water Act. So what's going to happen next? Well, what you can see here is the rest is history, because over time, what you saw is a series of Bay agreements, 4 Bay agreements in total, and also ultimately this pollution diet that was established in 2010, known as the total maximum daily load. That total maximum daily load, which I'm going to walk you through, essentially think of it like a pollution diet. How much pollution can you put in the water and still be healthy? It's similar to my own, say, diet, where so long as I stay, say, at 1,800 calories a day, then I don't gain weight. And so it's very similar. How do we keep the Chesapeake Bay healthy while still taking on some level of pollution? Because there are 18 million of us living in the watershed, so there clearly will be some level of pollution. Next. Okay, so the Clean Water Act. Let me take you on a whirlwind tour over some of the sections of the Clean Water Act and exactly what they mean to the Chesapeake Bay. Let me leave you with this thought. Because of the citizens caring in the region and all the organizations working on Chesapeake, we have taken the Clean Water Act and taken it much further. So we actually have programs that go way beyond the Clean Water Act, okay? But we also have compliance and enforcement issues, which make us able to take advantage of the Clean Water Act and constantly have to push for more. So first, let me mention Section 117. The Bay region is wholly unique in the country. It's really Narragansett Bay and the Chesapeake Bay that have this provision. Narragansett Bay because that was the chair of the committee at the time, and the Chesapeake because we were driving for it. And what it is it authorizes the Chesapeake Bay program. Okay, so once they conducted that study, they could have packed up their bags and left the states to themselves with now not federal coordination and oversight. But because of Section 117, it codified that state-federal relationship, the fact that the states and the commission and the federal government would work together for the long haul to protect and enhance not just the waters of Chesapeake Bay, but also the habitat, the access, the education going on in the Chesapeake, all of the different comprehensive elements of Bay restoration. This particular act told the administrator of EPA, you will administer this program, you will coordinate this program. And the other thing is it provided a vehicle for long-term ongoing science, ongoing monitoring, ongoing data analysis. So you might hear about the model that helps us to analyze how well we are doing, the monitoring programs that tell the truth about what's in the water. All of those things were basically authorized by Section 117. And over time, because then we had something to aim at, a program to aim at, we were able to grow the appropriation from $12 million originally to this year, we're at $88.5 million annually just in this program. Next. Okay, Section 106. Think about this for a minute. And this is mind-blowing in a way when you think about it. Section 106 is all about funding. And think of it as capacity, because this is the section of the Clean Water Act that funds point source permitting. Remember those pipes? All the pipes have a permit that tells that particular facility how much it can pollute. You go over it, it's too much pollution. Very similar to if I eat 1,900 calories and I'm only supposed to eat 1,800, then I'm over it, okay? And so that's how it's supposed to work. They're point source permitting, watershed planning, so that you can not only consider all of the point sources in a given area, but also other forms of pollution in that area, which may not be regulated, but they're still having an effect on the water. The monitoring and also what's called water quality standards. Those are the limit. Essentially, that's the target you're trying to get to in the water. what is the nitrogen concentration in the water supposed to be to support living resources, for example? What's the phosphorus concentration? What's the sediment concentration? And then, there are many other water quality standards. For example, think about the West. There's actually temperature standards for, say, salmon, things like that. So all of this is the funding, though. So what this is to actually fund the people who work in these areas. Next. So when you're thinking about MDE or DNR, or you're thinking about the people who work there, some of the most important people who work there are actually funded through this program. Now, I'm going to give you a very quick tour of what is she talking about at this point when it comes to, say, water quality standards. In the Chesapeake, we realized that not every organism needs the same requirements in every part of the bay. For example, spawning is going on in the shallow waters, say. You may need for the open waters, you may need for fish, for example, to go in and out of. You may need deep water seasonal areas where fish are going only certain times of the year. You may need water, say oysters for these deep water areas. Each one is going to have a different requirement. And so what they did was they zoned the bay next. And then after they zoned the bay, the next thing they did is they developed the criteria. What are the needs in each section? What you can see here is this is the dissolved oxygen requirements in the different sections. Okay, so for example, the 5 or 6, that means more oxygen, 5 to 6 milligrams per liter are needed for spawning fish. Okay, down here in the deepest waters, okay, you might have worms living there, for example, or fish swimming in and out, and you might only need 2 milligrams per liter. So the criteria is different in different parts of the bay. The Clean Water Act has helped us to develop those standards and those criteria. Next. Now, the other thing that it does is Betsy described how the NPDES permit process, that's the point source, pollution discharge elimination system. And this section of the law, not only did it help by requiring that, but it also then drove us to pass many state laws that then fund and further develop this. So for example, you may be familiar, for example, with say the flush fee in Maryland. We've pumped more than $2 billion into upgrading our sewage treatment plants. That's a good example of where we did that because of the requirements under the Clean Water Act. We've done that. Look, you take the sediment erosion control fences for granted all around the Chesapeake. Those actually weren't always there. They are really a part of responding to the Clean Water Act. So we've done major funding upgrades for our wastewater treatment plants in all 6 states, and the District of Columbia that has Blue Plains, which is the largest advanced sewage treatment plant in the country. We have it at state-of-the-art nitrogen removal. It's at 3 milligrams per liter. Next. Okay, and so the state revolving loan fund also, this is a huge program that pumps billions of dollars into the region. Just in the infrastructure bill alone, for example, Maryland got $14.2 million to upgrade many of their plants through the SRF program. Next. And the last one that I think it's the last one that I want to mention before closing out is Section 319. Section 319 really focuses on, I guess it's 2. Section 319 focuses on non-point source pollution. So again, it's that same staffing that's provided to the agencies to then pursue on the ground non-point source control and management programs. So it's everything from tree canopy programs to some agricultural work. It's stormwater work. It's work to basically prevent the kinds of plume, sediment plume that you're seeing in the lower part of this chart. Next. And then I mentioned the TMDL earlier. That's that diet. That's that pollution diet. And not only does the pollution diet exist, but it also requires accountability and transparency. So every 2 years, the jurisdictions in our region need to report on their progress, and they need to report on their intent for the next 2 years. So there's remarkable accountability in our region. And the bottom line is it can be sad, because what it also tells us beyond a shadow of a doubt is we are behind in our goals. But at least we have the accountability and the science to know that. Next. So where are we? Where are we in the Chesapeake region? In the Chesapeake region, look at this slide. This slide is nitrogen, and it's basically showing you trends. If you see a big blue dot, it means we're making we've done a lot of work in reducing the loads in those regions. If you see a smaller blue dot, it means we have made reductions in those regions, but it's not at the same scale. Now, in many cases, the big circles also either coincide with big point sources or big rivers like the James or the Susquehanna or the Potomac that are all running cleaner. 41% of the region's rivers are running cleaner right now. But I will also say that anywhere there's a yellow dot means we're beginning to see the trends go in the wrong direction. That means we need the Clean Water Act continuously, and we need more. We need more compliance, we need more enforcement, and we need more practices on the ground to protect it. Next. So in conclusion, what I just want to do is I want to make you think about something that really Taylor started with. Taylor started with a quote talking about, I don't know how to change the country or the world, but I know how to change my parish. Well, think about this. This is the watershed. These are individual people's parishes. This is the wildlands, the Pennsylvania wildlands in the northern part of the watershed. Watch the map in the upper corner if you don't know where you are, and you'll see moving around the watershed next is a very different thing. It looks very different. Think of the algae blooms, how they were different in different parts of the watershed. But for example, Lancaster's solutions will be different than all of the other solutions. Lancaster's will need to be agricultural. They'll have to be agricultural. Next. If you go to the Washington, D.C., then you've got to be looking at point source pollutions. You've got to be looking at stormwater pollutions. You have to be looking at how to increase your tree canopy cover and decrease your impervious surface. Next. Keep going. And again, in different parts of the bay, your solutions have to be different. They have to be different. Next. This is the Piedmont area in Virginia. Next. This is the Southern Bay, totally different environment, requiring very different solutions. Next. And this is the Eastern Shore. This is the Eastern Shore, the Chop Tank Complex. These last slides are really to show you, in conclusion, the Clean Water Act applies across the watershed, but the solutions are different in each location. And it's the citizens in each location, the parishes in each location, the synagogues in each location, the people who will make sure that the Clean Water Act is working for them, and that also their state is going beyond, that you're using the Clean Water Act as the foundation, not the ceiling. Next. So that's what I have to share with you today, except one last thing, which is my concluding slide, which I often use, happens to be Taylor. And I want you to notice that when you look at Taylor's face and you look at that girl behind him, you can see who was going into the environmental field. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I hope that you now see the impact of the Clean Water Act on the Chesapeake restoration. Thanks.
It is a wonderful photo. I'm so glad you included it. I'd like to welcome next Caitlin Schmidt, who's going to round out our conversation, and she's going to tell us all about how you can put the Clean Water Act to use.
Thanks, Taylor. And thanks, Anne, and thanks, Betsy, as well for your very informative presentations. So as Taylor mentioned, my name is Caitlin Schmidt. I'm a policy analyst here at the Center for Progressive Reform. And I'm here to talk about some more ways that states and communities can get involved in becoming clean water champions. Next slide, please. So the first way is that state agencies charged with implementing the Clean Water Act should focus on the primary goals of the Clean Water Act, which are to eliminate water pollution, looking at water pollution in totality. So this would seem like common sense, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot more to this story. So in April 2020, in a US Supreme Court case called County of Maui, Hawaii versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund, the court finally weighed in with an answer to a long-standing question about what kinds of pollution discharges rise to the level of a point source and require a permit under the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act prevents the addition of any pollutant to any navigable water, as Betsy mentioned earlier, of the United States from any so-called point source. A fixed point, as we've described, some sort of end of pipe discharging into a river without a permit. So how the definition of a point source is interpreted has significant impacts on water pollution prevention and the protection of the country's wetlands and waterways. This definition, however, has been subject to varying interpretations across administrations and courts for decades. But what about discharges from point sources into non-navigable waters, like groundwater, that ultimately flow into navigable waters, like for, say, the Pacific Ocean? This is exactly what the County of Maui, Hawaii versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund set out to answer. In this case, the County of Maui had used 4 injection wells about a half a mile away from the Pacific Ocean to dump roughly 4 million gallons of treated sewage a day into groundwater. The treated sewage ultimately made its way into the ocean and was wreaking havoc on nearby water quality and coral reefs. In a 6-3 opinion written by Justice Breyer, the court held that the Clean Water Act permit is required when there's a discharge from a point source into a navigable water, or importantly, when there is, quote unquote, a functional equivalent of a direct discharge into a navigable water. So the Hawaiian environmentalists who originally brought this case waged a 12-year battle in court just to ensure that the sewage that was discharging into the Pacific Ocean was actually subject to a Clean Water Act permit. While the case was actually remanded back to the lower courts, the ruling was actually considered a really big win for ensuring a more scientific approach to the Clean Water Act's coverage and confirming that industry or state and local governments can't circumvent the law by pumping pollution into groundwater before it's discharged into navigable surface waters. So there are many other loopholes like this in the Clean Water Act regulation and implementation that must be addressed so that we can get back to making meaningful progress towards our Clean Water Act goals. Next slide, please. So states should also put a greater emphasis on reducing non-point source pollution to our waterways. I won't belabor the point. I know my previous presenters talked much about non-point source pollution, but essentially it's runoff from surfaces like roads and driveways. We have concerning runoff from operations like farms, livestock operations, mining and construction activities. So whenever it rains or snow, this is the leading cause of water pollution, but it's not adequately addressed in the Clean Water Act. This is because the self-monitoring approach that's utilized by industrial end of pipe discharges or point sources does not really work for non-point source pollution, given that it arises intermittently and from a variety of different sources. So in order to address this, states must step up to ensure comprehensive monitoring and required implementation of best practices by industries that are notorious for non-point source pollution. And the general permit system that we have set up, where permittees are virtually self-regulated, is flawed and just allows too much non-point source pollution to enter our waterways. Next slide, please. So new Clean Water Act permits should reflect and respond to the adverse water quality impacts of climate change. So here's another really common sense recommendation. However, many states are really far behind in accomplishing this. The effects of climate change have and will continue to result in baseline changes to water quality, from increased flooding, extreme drought, and sea level rise, whether we like it or not. Another example of this, due to climate change, increased intensity and frequency of storms will result in greater hazardous chemical releases from industrial facilities and more stormwater runoff in local waterways. These combined changes will affect water chemistry, temperature, biological processes, aquatic food webs, and the suitability of water bodies for certain uses, all of which the Clean Water Act permitting regime is based off and set out to address. So because of this, all state permits under the Clean Water Act should at least incorporate and factor in the latest best practices for climate adaptation, while requiring comprehensive water quality monitoring and metrics to better understand and respond to local impacts on water quality from climate change. Next slide, please. So Clean Water Act permits should contain PFAS monitoring requirements for any facility that discharges PFAS through wastewater or stormwater using the latest technologies and relevant data. Due to widespread use and manufacturing for decades, unsafe levels of PFAS have been found in groundwater and surface water all over the United States. PFAS are man-made chemicals that have been used in industry and consumer products worldwide since the 1950s. They've been used in nonstick cookware, water-repellent clothing, stain-resistant fabrics and carpets, some cosmetics, some firefighting foams, and even products that resist grease, water, and oil. So the most commonly studied PFAS are known as perfluorooctanoic acid and then perfluorooctane sulfanic acid. Studies have demonstrated that PFAS exposure can harm aquatic habitats and adversely impact human health. The Clean Water Act permitting regime can reduce discharges of PFAS at the source and require comprehensive monitoring to ensure continued compliance with pollution limits. Likewise, there's a growing list of new toxic chemicals used in manufacturing and production. So in 1 year alone, in 2019, just the top 100 toxic polluters in the United States released 336.5 billion pounds of hazardous chemicals into the environment. So this is just 1 year. And of that, 113.2 million pounds went directly into the country's surface waterways. States must get a handle on regulating these new and emerging contaminants under the Clean Water Act to ensure the safety of our waterways and our drinking water moving forward. Next slide, please. States should also enhance public participation, notice, and transparency of water pollution impacts on downstream communities, the implementation of the Clean Water Act permitting program, and the regulation of non-point source pollution. So many state environmental regulatory systems contain insurmountable barriers for the public to fully or meaningfully participate, nor has there really been any meaningful attempt to engage frontline or environmental justice communities directly impacted by certain government actions, like the approval of a major project. For instance, in 2019, Wegmans Food Market notified Virginia's Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ for short, that it would need multiple permits to permanently destroy several acres of wetlands for a distribution center in Hanover County, Virginia. The current proposed site for the distribution center is located in an environmentally, culturally, and historically significant area near an environmental justice community that is overburdened with industrial development. Concerned community members almost missed, and many of them did miss, the public comment period for one of the state's key permits because notice was posted in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which is a subscriber-only paid newspaper, instead of the weekly free paper that all of the community members relied on. Many of the community members had also been regularly checking Virginia's regulatory town hall website for related notices, but they were not posted there. Instead, the draft permit for the project and the notice for the public hearing was posted on DEQ's webpage, and many community members had missed it. Additionally, DEQ had opted to host a virtual public hearing for one of the project's key permits, and many community members were concerned because broadband access and infrastructure in Hanover County is notoriously unreliable, and many needed to find childcare, which caused its own safety concerns during a pandemic. So the parameters for giving comments during the virtual hearing were not given until the hearing had started. So many had prepared lengthy comments only to learn that they only had 2 to 3 minutes each to speak. Many complained about inadequate access and then lost connection during the hearing, not even being able to speak at all. And this is just one of the scenarios where the state failed Virginians due to poor public engagement, notice, and information sharing, hampering its residents' ability to fully participate in these important regulatory processes. This story is all too common for communities across the country. Communities deserve better. They deserve to have adequate notice, proper tools, and access to all the relevant information for every given project that they may be impacted by. Next slide, please. So switching gears here a bit, state agencies must also update permits on a timely basis to avoid what we call quote unquote zombie permits. So the Clean Water Act specifies that NIPD's permits, as have been alluded to earlier, may not be issued for a term longer than 5 years. Permittees that wish to continue discharging beyond those 5 years must submit a complete application for a permit renewal. If the permitting authority receives a complete application but does not reissue the permit prior to the expiration date, then the permit is called administratively continued, or what we like to call zombie permits, where the permit is effectively expired or dead, but continues to live on past its expiration date. Timely renewal of permits is really important because it gives a chance for your state agency to analyze the pollutants being discharged and the appropriateness of the permit requirements, given any facility's compliance history, for instance. However, there's a backlog of zombie permits in most states. So this image here shown on the screen shows the amount of zombie permits in review in July 2021. So this was last year. And so at the time of the review, there were 153 permits that were considered zombie permits at the time, and 114 of those had been outdated for more than 1 year. Of those, 22 permits were zombie permits for 5 years or more, and 1 permit was even expired since 2006. So if MDE had not delayed in renewing these permits, some pollutant discharges to waterways from these facilities could have been prevented. These findings underscore the importance of state agencies allocating adequate resources to the permit renewal process. Next slide, please. So state agencies charged with implementing the Clean Water Act should vigorously pursue an increased budget for staffing and resources, and this should translate to vigorous enforcement of the Clean Water Act. In 2020, a report found non-compliance rates with some federal environmental laws reaching as high as 70%. State inspections have demonstrated sweeping non-compliance with the Clean Water Act, but even then, the number of inspections has continued to decrease. Pictured here, you can see the general decline in the number of clean water inspections over the years in Maryland from 2001 to 2021. In 2021, the Maryland Department of the Environment, or MDE, inspected close to 40% fewer sites than the 20-year historical average. There's also been a general decline in the number of enforcement actions taken and the number of significant violations identified by Maryland Department of the Environment. When there's no culture of consequences, bad actors or polluters will skirt their responsibilities under the law. Also pictured here in the 2 decades on the left, in the 2 decades between fiscal years 2002 and 2022, MDE lost 1 out of every 7 staff, with its agency budget of state general funds falling by more than 1/3, adjusting for inflation. MDE now represents less than 1/5 of 1% of Maryland's total state general fund budget, which is half of what it was 2 decades ago. Environmental enforcement activities, while the bedrock for ensuring the success of the Clean Water Act, are generally not public-facing, making state enforcement vulnerable to administrative and political whims and budget cuts. But without adequate enforcement of the law and the tools to do so, the Clean Water Act just becomes good advice. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so how can communities get involved? First, communities can spot and report pollution. The enforcement of the Clean Water Act is up to everyone. Congress intended it that way. And spotting pollution is easy, whether you're out walking your dog, out kayaking, or running errands. Just keep your eyes peeled for water pollution. You might see murky or dirty water leaving a construction site right after it rains. Or you might notice discoloration in a local water body near an industrial site, or see sewage discharging from a pipe at alarming rates. Just make sure to take documentation. You can take a photo or video with your phone, and make sure to be thorough and look around for any impacts from that pollution, such as dead fish, unusual looking water, or debris. State agencies and local governments have pollution reporting hotlines, so you can check with your local government. There are also local water keepers all across the country that you can contact, and they're a really great point of contact and typically have pollution reporting hotlines as well. Next slide, please. Communities can advocate for clean water protections to state agencies and legislatures while opposing projects that pollute our waterways. States can always pass environmental rules that are more protective than the federal rules that we have in place, which is exciting. So I hope that you'll join me in pushing our states to adopt many of the recommendations that I've outlined throughout my presentation and close loopholes that are leading to the degradation of our waters. There's so many ways that you can champion clean water as a community advocate. You can submit public comments on permits and regulations. You can voice your concerns to state agencies. You can testify at legislative hearings, and you can meet with and pressure your state legislator and local government officials to do the right thing when it comes to clean water. Next slide, please. If you're having trouble getting started as a clean water advocate, there are plenty of organizations you can get involved with and volunteer. Many organizations host stream cleanups and tree plantings, but there are also many roles to play in ensuring that clean water for everybody, and many nonprofit organizations can really use the support. So there are organizations that sue polluters. As Betsy mentioned, there are organizations that really watchdog government agencies and ensure that they're doing the right thing and track enforcement data related to those agencies. There are organizations that advocate for the passage of laws and provide on-the-ground clean water restoration efforts. And all of these different roles are key to the clean water movement here in the Bay region. It takes an army to do this work, but when everyone comes together towards a common solution, we've seen real progress happen, even at the state and local levels. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, but thank you so much for your time today, and I really look forward to hearing any questions.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you so much to both of our other speakers. We're now going to open the floor for questions from you all. It looks like the chat is filling up, so I have not immediately gotten to take a look at it, but we'll start diving into there and see what people have written. You are also welcome to use the reactions, which you can find in the triple dots at the bottom of the screen, where you'll find a hand raise icon. You can raise your hand and ask your questions if you want, or again, put them right in the chat. Take a look, go back and see if we can find any. Well, I have a question to start, so I'll get us going. Betsy, this one is going to be directed to you, but it comes from what I think Caitlin was talking about at the end. Caitlin was really highlighting that we have kind of two things, powerful things that we can do as citizens. We can help urge our legislators to pursue some of what she was talking about, and we can work alongside the water keepers and use them as the reporting eyes and ears on our rivers. So for the folks in the room, how do they meet their water keeper? How do they report pollution to them? And if they don't live somewhere with a water keeper, how do they report it?
Great question. Thanks, Taylor. And thanks, Caitlin, for teeing that up. I expect while I'm speaking, the fabulous Robin Broder will throw in the chat our website, where we have a map of all of our local water keepers. So if you live in the Chesapeake region, your water keepers, there we go. Look at that. She just did it. So you can find your local water keeper that way. You can also always contact us at Water Keepers Chesapeake. Our purpose is to help advocate for our water keepers, but in terms of helping us to work together as well to get out there and identify problems. But if you use the Water Reporter app, which is a free online app, it will also, if there's a waterkeeper and you're out there documenting a pollution problem, it can automatically send it to the waterkeeper for you. So you don't even have to contact them. But all of our waterkeepers from Pennsylvania down through Virginia, most of them are in Maryland, but not exclusively in this region, have pollution reporting hotlines of some sort. A lot of them you can do online these days. You can call and talk to somebody and they can help you to identify what it is, investigate it, and get some action on it, get it to the local government agency for enforcement, or if it's something really bad that has been ignored for a while, to potentially consider filing a lawsuit.
Thank you so much for all that, Betsy. Does anyone else have questions? You're more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask away. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about the Clean Water Act. I have experts in the room that can talk about all manner of Chesapeake related topics.
Can I ask a question?
We would love that.
This is Ruth Ann. I am actually I live on the high point between the Sassafras River and the Lipstick River. So I'm right in between two watersheds, one into the Chesapeake and one into the Delaware Bay. And I have struggled to become a water keeper. Like I want my river on the map, and I want to learn how to do that. So do you have suggestions for how to become a water keeper?
Yes, I would say you have done the first thing that will help, which is let me know. I'm the regional rep for this area for the whole Waterkeeper Alliance that provides the licenses. So we can talk about it. But there's a ton of ways, you know, obviously you could consider starting your own Riverkeeper organization, but for people who can't do that, we all need as much help as we can get to get everything done. As Caitlin was mentioning, you know, on things like legislative advocacy, having community members come and speak is a lot more interesting to legislators, but you can tell your direct story in that context. And they don't want to necessarily hear from us, right? They want to hear from the person who is their constituent who's directly impacted. So Ruth Ann, I am happy to follow up with you about that and would love to talk about starting an organization. But for those who, you know, aren't quite there yet, you can volunteer, work with us, testify. We can get you involved.
Ruth Ann, I just want to point out that, you know, through time, many of the organizations across the Chesapeake didn't exist. So each one really began in some effort. I know I was very involved in starting the Chester River Association, but at the time I was really working on the Chester River Association, the Sassafras River Association, and an organization called the Friends of St. Mary's. And what I would say in the end of the day, what happens is a few people, it's really not an enormous number of people, but a few just really get the momentum going and then stay at it until the organization is built to the point where it has a board and some bylaws. And one of the things that I learned, and it's associated with something that I'm reading in the chat, but when you do that organization, it has to be a combination of looking at the things that are perhaps troubling and also having fun. Because in the end, we all come to water and the environment, you know, because it's fun, or that it makes us happy in one, or healthy in one way or another. And so I would say in any effort that you do, find the joy as well as the challenge. Related to that, I want to just say something about the Chesapeake. When I moved to the Chesapeake region, there were 12 million people. There are 18 million people in the watershed now. That means the population grew by half. In that same period of time, the pollutant load was cut by a quarter. So have we met the goals? No. But is the bay, meaning the watershed, in a much better position? You bet. You bet. And there are still highly productive fisheries, and there are efforts underway to make them more productive and the water's even cleaner. So I would always remember that your efforts influencing the General Assemblies, planting your own trees, you know, picking up yard waste, whatever it is that you're doing is obviously mattering, because you're one of the 18 million people crowding this watershed and making it better.
We did have one question come in from Diane Ray. She said, the Chesapeake Bay is a national treasure. How successful have we been in gaining support for cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay from other areas of the country?
I don't mind taking that, in that, you know, Reagan declared the Bay a national treasure. The Section 117 of the Clean Water Act was voted on by House and Senate members from 50 states. So it's not something that was just, you know, acted on by the local region. The Chesapeake Watershed Initiative in the 2008 Farm Bill that pumped $52 million annually into the region for 6 years. That was voted on by every, you know, by House and Senate members nationwide. So there is nationwide recognition that the Chesapeake matters. It's the largest, most productive estuary in the country. But in the same breath, there's also Chesapeake fatigue, and there's Chesapeake envy. So we have to always also help other regions in the country know what has worked and not worked and be helpful to them. The only way you can have a friend is if you're a friend back.
Great, thank you.
Do we have other questions? A couple more minutes before I'll close this out. Wendy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. What Ann just said made me think about that when she said how many people are now living in the Chesapeake Bay area. And I'm a very avid kayaker. I live in Lancaster, actually, so I come down to the Eastern Shore to kayak. And it made me think about something the Chesapeake Bay Foundation was saying a couple of years ago. They had a catchphrase, "No child left inside," if anyone knows that.
Yeah.
And as a kayaker, it's really hard to find a place to put my boat on the water. There's almost no access. Everything's privatized. And it made me think of that statement, "No child left inside." Like, if people can't get to the water and enjoy it, they might not have much interest in saving it. So I know it's a little bit of a side issue, but I do think that that's important too, because if people don't have access to the water, what do they care? You know, it doesn't affect them. So that's it.
I wanted to give you a tiny little bit of good news on that, Wendy, and you might know about this, but there are efforts underway to create a Chesapeake National Recreation Area. And my colleague Robin Broder sits on the steering committee for that. But it's a very broad committee of organizations working on this, and that would be really using opportunities to enhance recreational access and ensure that it's done equitably to include all communities throughout the area. So let's keep our fingers crossed. You'll be hearing more on that.
Fantastic.
The other thing I want to, because we're involved in that as well. The other thing I want to mention is this: if you're an avid kayaker, then you know that the way to the water is to break the law by putting your boat in somewhere near a bridge. And anybody who's a kayaker knows that. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is carry legislation in each state that actually requires, when a bridge is being rebuilt or refurbished, okay, restored, that at least there's a requirement to consider access. So that falls short of requiring it, but it's like the first step, which is to basically allow communities to consider it. And then we're also looking at federal transportation dollars, which can be used for the planning purpose of planning these accesses at key transportation, crossroads with bridges. So I really encourage you to, when you're talking to a local elected official, for example, or state elected official, just bring it up, because the more they're hearing the topic, the more they might consider that.
We're just about out of time, but Kathleen, I saw your hand was up, so I'm going to let you take away our last question here. Kathleen, you're on mute if you're trying to share something.
Okay, sorry. Yes, I got to unmute. Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, those are wonderful presentations, and a lot of people aren't aware of all the background for the Clean Water Act, and how to take advantage of it to help clean up waterways. And one of the areas that we've been kind of running up against a barrier is emerging pollutants, chemical pollutants, and particularly plastics and microplastics, and the whole issue of TMDLs. If there isn't a TMDL for something, then it kind of doesn't get addressed. And so I was wondering, this wonderful panel, if I could get some insights or ways forward on how to address some of these emerging and important water pollutants, and what we could do to start to make a difference there.
Caitlin, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, I was just unmuting myself. So right now, the EPA essentially needs to establish standards for PFAS. The EPA has been studying PFAS for quite some time, and these microplastics for quite some time. More recently, they did come out with, I believe it was called like a roadmap to regulating PFAS, where it was a very sort of detailed action plan. And this is the most that I think we've seen ever from the EPA on this front. So I took it as sort of really encouraging, and they're going to be using the next couple of years to do sort of comprehensive monitoring and assessment, but then, transition to sort of the promulgation of rules around PFAS under the Clean Water Act. So that's sort of all I've got to share for now on sort of what's happening on PFAS. At the state levels, we certainly, states across the country are stepping up to sort of fill that gap that the EPA has not, in terms of setting national standards for microplastics. So we've seen sort of varying, various state laws across the state, ensuring like better sort of monitoring and pre-treatment requirements for PFAS at the facilities that are manufacturing and using those chemicals. So there is another means outside of the EPA to sort of pressure your state agency to make sure that it's adequately regulated. And I believe there was some movement more recently here in Maryland on PFAS. So I'll kick it over to Betsy to shed a little bit more light on that one.
Yes, there was actually a big success this session in Maryland, prohibiting any more use of, and then creating some standards for the oldest of the PFAS chemicals. And was the CDC involved in that too? Okay, well, so we can all enjoy this one a little bit. So I will then pass it to you.
We did carry legislation this session addressing PFAS. PFAS is in carpets, for example. It's also in firefighting foam because it does such a good job of suppressing oil-based fires. And so first we carried legislation to just ban it when you were training for a fire, because of course, why train with it? Only use it when you really need it. But then this year it actually even passed they're going to phase out its content in carpets, in various types of fast food packaging and also in firefighting foam. Let me say this. Oftentimes we can't wait for the federal standard to be set. It's often too slow when you have that many states doing it. So what happens, this happened with microbeads in Maryland as well, where a state or many states, that's the preference, will carry local legislation. And at some point, there's enough of a problem in terms of manufacturing that the manufacturers then almost petition the federal government to establish the standard so that different states, you know, they don't have mixed rules when they're trying to make a product for the whole country. So oftentimes promoting that local action will actually help to then push the federal government to establish a national standard.
Yes, and just one tiny little thought on that. The fastest way to get these problems to stop is to make the person who makes these nasty chemicals take them back.
Yep. Right, we're looking at producer responsibility laws right now related to plastics. That's a policy analysis we're doing right now. Yeah. Yeah.
So essentially, push for your state, you know, don't wait for, you know, the federal, you know, or TMDLs, but you push for regulations at the state level. I mean, I guess it would be helpful if we had the big states like California. I guess they always environmental regulations as California goes, so the rest of the country, because they're so huge. So in some ways, I guess if we're concerned about some of these emerging pollutants, even though California is on the other side of the country, it might be helpful to work with them there, because it'll actually end up affecting the rest of us. That's an interesting, interesting take.
The political dynamics are, you have to get some East Coast states doing it, because they're always like, those Birkenstock, you know, wearing people in California. And so you really have to try to do it on both sides of the country and sweep the middle. Yeah.
Kathleen, that was a wonderful question. Thank you so much for closing us out. I'm going to steal the microphone back for just a couple seconds, and then we will bid you all a wonderful evening. So events like this don't happen without you folks who are in the room, and we are looking for help with the next year's series of Chesapeake Conversations already. Please, if you're interested in helping us host one of these or offer ideas for subject matter that you would be interested in and your congregation might also be interested in, check out this link. My coworker is going to be putting it in the chat right now. It's a small survey, fill it out. We'd love to hear back from you. We'd love to work on one of these events with you. Finally, we have a couple ways that you can really get involved with what IPC is doing. First and foremost is signing our partner congregation pledge. We have over 100 congregations now that have taken this pledge across the watershed. It's a fantastic way to galvanize support internally within your congregation and remind folks of what you're doing and how you're part of a bigger movement. Remember, we don't do this. We don't accomplish Chesapeake restoration unless all of us are caring for our backyard. And this pledge is an amazing place to start. If you're not quite at the point yet where your congregation is ready to take that pledge, though, we do offer, coming up in this fall, a 3-part training series to help you grow a team, meet new friends within your congregation, gain the support of your faith leaders, create an action plan, and go forth to take on Chesapeake stewardship. This is a really cool opportunity to get started. It's a great way to meet your regional coordinators. It's a really good entry point. So we recommend that you check it out. Finally, I want to just give a huge thank you from all of us for tonight's program and for your attendance. We're really thankful for you coming and for you enjoying what we had to say. So again, thank you. Gotta go.